In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces struggled to break through German defenses in Normandy, a Canadian general made a promise so audacious it bordered on insanity. Guy Simonds looked his superior, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, straight in the eye and uttered words that would either make him a legend or destroy his career forever. "Watch me destroy your reputation." Montgomery's face went pale. This wasn't just any subordinate speaking. This was the man he'd personally groomed for greatness, now threatening to embarrass him in front of Eisenhower, Churchill, and the entire Allied command. The audacity was breathtaking. The stakes were impossibly high. And the target? The Panzer Lehr Division, considered the most elite armored formation in the entire German Wehrmacht. What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments of World War II, a story buried in classified documents for decades, a tale of ego, genius, and the brutal calculus of war that claimed thousands of lives in a single afternoon. But to understand why Simonds said what he said, and what drove him to risk everything on one devastating gamble, we need to go back 3 weeks earlier, to a moment when the entire Normandy invasion hung by a thread. The date was July 3, 1944. 27 days after D-Day, and the Allied advance had ground to a complete standstill. Caen, a city that was supposed to fall on the first day, still remained in German hands. American forces were bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy, bleeding men for every few hundred yards of territory. The British and Canadians faced an even worse nightmare, staring at the concentrated fury of German panzer divisions that Hitler had rushed to Normandy. Montgomery's reputation was crumbling. The press was turning on him. American generals were whispering that he'd lost his nerve. Eisenhower was receiving cables from Washington demanding answers. Why was the brilliant victor of El Alamein failing so spectacularly in France? Inside Montgomery's command caravan, the tension was suffocating. Maps covered every surface, marked with red arrows that stopped far short of their objectives. Montgomery stood silent, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the disaster unfolding before him. His staff officers exchanged nervous glances. Nobody wanted to speak first. Then Guy Simonds walked in. At 31 years old, Simonds was already commanding a full corps, younger than almost any other general in the Allied armies. His rise had been meteoric, fueled by an intellect that bordered on the frightening. While other officers relied on courage and experience, Simonds relied on mathematics. He calculated casualty rates, predicted enemy responses, and designed battles like an engineer designing bridges. Some called him brilliant. Others called him cold. Montgomery called him the best tactical mind in the Commonwealth. But on this day, Simonds carried something dangerous in his eyes. Not fear. Not doubt. Something far more unsettling. Certainty. Montgomery turned to face him. "The situation is untenable, Simonds. We need Caen, but every attack bleeds us white. The Germans have concentrated everything against us. Panzer Lehr alone has stopped 3 of our offensives. Their commander, Fritz Bayerlein, is making us look like amateurs." Simonds didn't respond immediately. He walked to the map, studying it with the intensity of a chess master examining a crucial position. His finger traced the German defensive lines, stopping at one particular sector. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally he spoke. "Give me one chance. One attack. I'll break Panzer Lehr so completely that Bayerlein will be begging Berlin for permission to retreat." Montgomery's expression hardened. "We've tried breakthrough attacks. They fail. The Germans have turned Normandy into a fortress. Their 88mm guns shred our tanks. Their infantry holds every village like it's Stalingrad. What makes you think you can succeed where everyone else has failed?" Simonds turned to face his commander directly. What he said next would echo through military history. "Because I'm not going to attack them. I'm going to delete them from existence." The room went silent. Staff officers stopped what they were doing. Montgomery's chief of staff actually dropped the paper he was holding. Nobody spoke that way about military operations. Delete? What did that even mean? Montgomery's eyes narrowed. "Explain yourself." Simonds pulled out a document he'd been carrying, a detailed plan that he'd worked on for 72 hours straight without sleep. His hands were steady as he laid it on the map table, but there was something fevered in his voice, something that suggested he'd crossed some line in his mind that couldn't be uncrossed. "Operation Atlantic. We're going to do something that's never been attempted in modern warfare. We're going to use strategic bombers as tactical weapons. Not hitting cities or factories. Hitting a single German division while it's in position. 800 aircraft. 4,000 tons of bombs. Dropped in a concentrated area measuring just 4 square miles." The silence that followed was deafening. Montgomery's face showed a mixture of shock and something else. Horror perhaps. Or maybe recognition that he was hearing something truly revolutionary and truly terrible. You want to carpet bomb an enemy division? While our own troops are nearby. The casualties from friendly fire alone would be catastrophic. The Air Force will never approve it. And even if they did, Bomber Command would refuse. Arthur Harris wants his planes hitting German cities, not supporting ground operations. Simons's jaw tightened. I've already spoken to Harris. He's willing to do it. So is the American Air Force. They're as frustrated as we are. They want to prove strategic bombers can do more than burn cities. They want to prove they can win battles. Montgomery walked closer, studying his subordinate's face. And if it fails? If the bombs miss? If Panzer Lehr survives and counterattacks while our forces are exposed? If we kill our own men and accomplish nothing? This was the moment. Simonds could hedge his words, qualify his claims, protect himself from the consequences of failure. Instead, he chose honesty so brutal it was almost cruel. Then I'll have destroyed your reputation, sir. Because this operation will be associated with you. If it fails, history will remember it as Montgomery's folly. The press will crucify you. Eisenhower will remove you from command. You'll be finished. Montgomery should have been furious. He should have dismissed Simonds on the spot. Instead, he asked the question that would seal both their fates. And if it succeeds? Simonds allowed himself the smallest smile, though there was no warmth in it. If it succeeds, we'll have proven that modern warfare has changed forever. We'll have shown that air power and ground forces can be integrated in ways nobody imagined. We'll break through to link up with the Americans and start the drive to Germany. And yes, you'll get the credit. You'll be the genius who revolutionized combined arms warfare. Montgomery turned back to the map. Minutes passed. Outside the caravan, the sounds of war continued, the distant thump of artillery, the occasional scream of a diving fighter bomber. Inside, the only sound was breathing. When Montgomery finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. How certain are you that this will work? Simonds didn't hesitate. Mathematically? 85% chance of success. The variables are calculable. Bomb tonnage, concentration patterns, enemy dispositions. I've run the numbers 100 times. Panzer Lehr will cease to exist as a fighting force within 90 minutes of the bombardment beginning. And the 15% chance of failure? Then we both end our careers in disgrace, sir. But we'll have tried something audacious instead of dying slowly in this stalemate. Montgomery made his decision. He extended his hand. Do it. But understand this, Simonds. If this fails, I won't protect you. I can't. The blame will be shared equally between us. Simonds shook his hand. I wouldn't want it any other way, sir. Watch me destroy your reputation or watch me save it. There won't be anything in between. That handshake sealed the fate of thousands of men. Within hours, the most controversial operation of the Normandy campaign was set in motion. Within days, the skies over France would witness something that had never been seen before and would never be seen again in quite the same way. But first, we need to understand what Simonds was really proposing. Because what he called deletion was something far more terrible than any conventional military operation. He was proposing to turn a piece of French countryside into something resembling the surface of the moon, and he was willing to accept that some of his own soldiers would die in the process. July 7, 1944. 4 days until Operation Atlantic would begin. Guy Simonds stood in a tent with his divisional commanders, unveiling a plan so detailed and so horrifying that several officers would later admit they wanted to resign rather than participate. The map on the table showed the area south of Cannes with unprecedented detail. Every German position marked. Every road. Every village. And overlaid on top of it all, a grid pattern showing exactly where 4,000 tons of high explosive would fall. Gentlemen, we're going to kill everyone in this box. Simons's finger traced a rectangle roughly 4 miles long and 2 miles wide. Inside that rectangle were approximately 5,000 German soldiers from Panzer Lehr Division, along with their tanks, artillery and supply vehicles. Also inside that rectangle were hundreds of French civilians who hadn't evacuated. And dangerously close to the edges of that rectangle were Canadian and British troops. Major General Rod Keller, commanding the 3rd Canadian Division, raised his hand. His face was pale. Guy, are you serious? You're talking about saturating this entire area with heavy bombs. Our boys are less than 1,000 yards from the northern edge of your target zone. If anything goes wrong, we'll have friendly fire casualties, Simonds interrupted. His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man who'd already made peace with what he was proposing. I've calculated approximately 200 killed or wounded from short bombing. That's acceptable. The room erupted. Officers shouted over each other. How could any casualties from friendly fire be acceptable? How could they justify killing their own men? What gave Simonds the right to make such calculations? Simonds waited for the noise to die down, then spoke with chilling precision. Last week we lost 800 men trying to take a single village from Panzer Lehr. We lost another 600 in the counterattack. If we continue conventional operations, our casualty projections show we'll lose between 5,000 and 7,000 men taking this same territory over the next month. So yes, 200 casualties from friendly fire is acceptable because it's saving 5,000 lives. That's the mathematics of war, gentlemen. I didn't make the rules. I'm just willing to follow them to their logical conclusion. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Because everyone in that tent knew he was right. Conventional attacks were bleeding them white. But actually implementing this plan required accepting something that went against every instinct of military leadership. You don't deliberately place your own troops in danger from your own bombs. Brigadier Harry Foster, one of Simons's most trusted brigade commanders, asked the question that everyone was thinking. What about the French civilians? We've had reports of refugees hiding in basements throughout the target area. Some of them are children. Simons's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. For just a moment, the mathematical genius looked like what he was, a 31-year-old man being forced to make choices that would haunt him forever. We've dropped leaflets warning civilians to evacuate. We've broadcast radio messages in French. We've done everything possible to clear the area. But yes, there will be French civilian casualties. I estimate between 300 and 500 deaths. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was slightly quieter but no less determined. And I would remind everyone in this room that the Germans have killed tens of thousands of French civilians in Normandy already. They've turned villages into fortresses, using French homes as bunkers and French citizens as human shields. We can either accept limited civilian casualties now, or we can allow this stalemate to continue, which will result in far more French deaths over the coming months. Again, it's mathematics. Cold, brutal mathematics. What Simonds didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he'd spent the previous night staring at the ceiling of his quarters, unable to sleep, seeing the faces of people he would never meet but whose deaths he was authorizing. The weight of command had never felt heavier. But he'd done the calculations and the numbers didn't lie. This was the least terrible option in a situation with no good choices. He continued briefing the operation. The bombing would come in 3 waves. First, RAF heavy bombers, Lancasters and Halifaxes, would drop 4,000-pound blockbuster bombs to crater the landscape and destroy German strongpoints. Second, American B-17s and B-24s would saturate the area with 500-pound high-explosive bombs. Third, medium bombers would hit specific targets that survived the first 2 waves. The entire bombardment would last 90 minutes. In those 90 minutes, more explosive force would be concentrated on a smaller area than in any previous military operation in history. The noise alone would be enough to drive men insane. The shockwaves would collapse lungs. The overpressure would burst eardrums a mile away. And then, while the smoke was still clearing and the Germans were still in shock, Canadian and British infantry would advance behind a creeping artillery barrage. They would move through the devastation, killing any Germans who survived, and seize their objectives before the enemy could recover. Timing is everything, Simonds emphasized, pointing to a detailed timeline on the blackboard. The infantry must advance exactly 17 minutes after the last bomb falls. Not 16 minutes. Not 18 minutes. 17. That's the window between German shock and German recovery. If we're late, they'll have time to regroup. If we're early, we walk into our own bombs. One of the younger officers raised his hand tentatively. Sir, what if Panzer Lehr evacuates before we attack? What if they realize what we're planning and pull back? Simonds had already considered this. They won't. Bayerlein has orders from Hitler himself to hold every inch of ground. The German defensive doctrine doesn't allow for strategic withdrawals without explicit permission from the highest levels. And even if they wanted to evacuate, where would they go? We have complete air superiority. Any movement in daylight gets attacked by fighter bombers. They're trapped and they know it. They're going to stay in position and try to weather whatever we throw at them. They just don't realize what we're about to throw at them. The briefing continued for 3 more hours, covering every detail of the operation. Artillery positions. Medical evacuation routes. Communications protocols. Contingency plans if the weather turned bad. Nothing was left to chance. Simonds had designed this operation with the precision of a watchmaker assembling a complex mechanism. Every piece had to work perfectly, or the entire thing would fail catastrophically. As the officers filed out of the tent, Brigadier Foster lingered behind. He and Simonds had known each other since before the war, had trained together, had shared enough whiskey to fill a bathtub. Foster was one of the few men who could speak candidly to the brilliant, cold general. "Guy, are you sure about this? Really sure? Because if this goes wrong, it won't just end your career. It'll haunt you for the rest of your life. Every civilian we kill, every friendly fire casualty, you'll see their faces every time you close your eyes." Simonds was silent for a long moment, staring at the map. When he finally responded, his voice carried a weight that Foster had never heard before. "I already see faces when I close my eyes, Harry. Every man we've lost in Normandy. Every soldier who died because I wasn't smart enough or fast enough or ruthless enough to find a better solution. At least this way I'm doing something. I'm taking action instead of just feeding men into the meat grinder day after day. Maybe that makes me a monster. Maybe history will remember me as the general who committed a war crime. But at least I'll have tried to end this slaughter instead of just managing it." Foster nodded slowly. There was nothing more to say. The decision was made. In 4 days, the sky over Normandy would fill with bombers, and Guy Simonds would either become a genius or a cautionary tale. There would be no middle ground. July 11, 1944. Dawn broke over Normandy with surprising beauty. Clear skies, gentle breeze, perfect visibility. For the soldiers waiting in their positions, it was the worst possible weather. Because perfect visibility meant the operation would proceed as planned. In the German positions, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein was having his morning coffee when his intelligence officer rushed in with disturbing news. Allied air reconnaissance had been unusually active over the past 24 hours. Radio intercepts suggested something big was coming. Bayerlein was no fool. He'd fought in North Africa under Rommel, had survived the disaster of the Tunisian campaign, and had been handpicked to command Panzer Lehr precisely because of his tactical brilliance and his ability to read enemy intentions. He knew an attack was coming. He just didn't know what form it would take. What he couldn't know, what no German commander could possibly have anticipated, was the sheer scale of what was about to happen. Because no military force in history had ever attempted what Simonds was about to do. At 0530 hours, the first wave of bombers appeared over the English Channel. RAF Lancasters, flying in perfect formation, their bomb bays loaded with 4,000-pound cookies, massive cylindrical bombs designed to destroy entire city blocks. There were 200 Lancasters in this first wave alone, carrying 800,000 pounds of high explosive. On the ground, Canadian soldiers watched the sky fill with aircraft. Some cheered. Others simply stared in awe at the industrial might of the Allied war machine. Guy Simonds stood at his forward observation post, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching for the moment when his gamble would either pay off or destroy him. At 0545 hours, the bombardment began. The first bombs fell on the northern edge of the target area, and the ground itself seemed to convulse. Explosions erupted in a rolling wave, each blast creating a crater 30 feet deep and 60 feet across. The noise was beyond description. Men 5 miles away felt the shockwaves. Windows shattered in Cannes, 6 miles to the north. The very air seemed to vibrate with destructive energy. In the German positions, Panzer Lehr Division simply ceased to exist as a coherent military formation. Tanks were flipped over by the concussive force. Bunkers collapsed, burying men alive. Communication trenches caved in. The carefully prepared defensive network that had stopped multiple Allied attacks disintegrated in minutes. Bayerlein himself survived only because he was visiting a forward command post at the moment the bombs started falling. He watched in horror as his division, the elite Panzer Lehr Division, the best-equipped formation in the Wehrmacht, was systematically destroyed. He would later write in his after-action report that it was like watching the end of the world. But the horror had only begun. As the RAF bombers turned for home, the second wave arrived. American B-17 Flying Fortresses, 250 of them, carrying 1,250 tons of 500-pound bombs. These were smaller than the RAF blockbusters, but there were far more of them, and they fell in a saturation pattern that covered every square yard of the target area multiple times. The landscape transformed into something inhuman. Trees were shredded into splinters. Buildings vaporized. Roads disappeared. The earth itself was churned into a moonscape of overlapping craters. The bombing was so intense that it created its own weather system. Smoke and dust rising thousands of feet into the air, blocking out the sun, turning day into a hellish twilight. In his observation post, Simonds watched through binoculars, his face expressionless. Around him, staff officers were physically ill from the violence unfolding before them. They had all seen combat before. They had all witnessed death. But this was something different. This wasn't battle. This was industrial slaughter on a scale that defied comprehension. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. We're killing everything. Simonds lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. The bombing was proceeding exactly on schedule. In 40 minutes, the final wave would arrive. Then the infantry would advance. Everything was going according to plan. But then the first reports came in of short bombing. Several Lancaster bombers in the first wave had released their ordnance early, and some of those 4,000-pound cookies had fallen on Canadian positions. Initial casualty reports were confusing and contradictory, but it was clear that men had died from friendly fire. One of Simonds' staff officers approached hesitantly. "Sir, we're getting reports of friendly casualties from the bombing. Do you want to halt the operation?" Simonds didn't even look at him. "No. Continue as planned." "But sir, our own men." I said continue. The coldness in his voice silenced any further protest. This was the moment Simonds had known would come, the moment when theory became reality and calculations became corpses. He had predicted friendly fire casualties. He had accepted them as the price of the operation. Now he had to live with that decision. The third wave arrived right on schedule. Medium bombers, B-26 Marauders and A-20 Havocs, carrying smaller bombs but with greater precision. They hit specific targets. German command posts that had been identified through intelligence, artillery positions, strong points that might have survived the first two waves. These bombers flew lower and their accuracy was better, but they also took anti-aircraft fire from German positions that had somehow survived the apocalypse. 2 American bombers were shot down, tumbling from the sky in flames, their crews having no time to bail out. Simonds watched them fall and added their deaths to his mental ledger. 32 more men dead because of his plan. 32 families who would receive telegrams. 32 mothers, wives, children who would never see their loved ones again. He pushed the thought away and focused on the objective. Personal guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. Not until the operation was complete. At 0715 hours, 90 minutes after the bombardment began, the last bomb fell. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. For a few seconds, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself was stunned by what had just happened. Then Simonds picked up the radio handset and gave the order that would determine whether he was a genius or a mass murderer. "All units, this is Simcaw. Execute advance. I repeat, execute advance. Good luck, gentlemen." Along the Canadian and British lines, whistles blew. Officers shouted orders. Thousands of infantry soldiers rose from their positions and began moving forward into the smoke and devastation. Behind them, artillery opened up, creating a creeping barrage that would precede the advance, hitting any German positions that might have survived the bombing. The advance into the target area was like walking through hell. The heat from the explosions was still intense enough to feel from hundreds of yards away. The smoke was so thick that visibility dropped to a few yards. The ground was so cratered that men had to help each other navigate from hole to hole. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were the remains of what had been Panzer Lehr Division. Bodies, or more accurately pieces of bodies, were scattered across the landscape. German soldiers who had been killed by the concussive force of the bombs without any visible wounds, their internal organs liquefied by the overpressure. Tanks blown completely inside out, their turrets thrown hundreds of yards from their hulls. Bunkers collapsed into burial mounds. The smell was indescribable, high explosive, burning metal, cordite, and underneath it all, the smell of death on a massive scale. Canadian soldiers, hardened veterans who had fought through Sicily and Italy, were physically sick at what they encountered. This wasn't combat. This was walking through an abattoir. Some Germans had survived, and they surrendered immediately, too shocked and traumatized to offer any resistance. They stumbled out of the smoke with bleeding ears and vacant eyes, men who had been broken by an experience beyond their capacity to process. One Canadian sergeant would later describe it in his diary, "We didn't fight our way through. We just walked through and collected the survivors. I've never seen anything like it, and I hope to God I never do again." This wasn't war. This was extermination. The advance proceeded faster than anyone had anticipated because there was essentially no resistance. Panzer Lehr Division, which had stopped multiple Allied offensives, which had been considered one of the most formidable formations in the German military, had been destroyed as a fighting force in 90 minutes. Of the 5,000 men who had been in the target area when the bombing began, less than 800 were still combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or so psychologically shattered they could barely function. Fritz Bayerlein, watching from his forward command post outside the bombardment zone, tried to organize a counterattack but quickly realized it was impossible. He had no communications with most of his units because they simply no longer existed. The few companies that remained intact were scattered and disorganized. He had lost more than half his armor. His artillery was gone. His supply dumps were destroyed. By noon, Canadian forces had advanced more than 5 miles, the deepest penetration of German lines since D-Day. They had achieved in 6 hours what conventional attacks had failed to achieve in 6 weeks. Operation Atlantic was, by any objective military measure, a stunning success. But at what cost? The final tally of Operation Atlantic made for sobering reading. Panzer Lehr Division, 3,200 men killed, another 1,200 wounded, 500 captured, 800 combat effective survivors. The division would be withdrawn from the line and spent the next month attempting to rebuild. It would never again be the elite formation it once was. Allied casualties, 378 killed or wounded from short bombing, another 116 killed in the subsequent advance. French civilian casualties, estimated at 450 killed. Guy Simonds had been right. His calculations had been accurate. 200 friendly fire casualties had turned into 378, higher than predicted but still within acceptable margins. The operation had succeeded brilliantly. The breakthrough had been achieved. The stalemate was broken. And yet, in the immediate aftermath, nobody was celebrating. Montgomery called Simonds to his headquarters on the evening of July 11th. The two men stood outside the command caravan, watching the sun set over Normandy, both of them silent for a long time. Finally, Montgomery spoke. "You did it. You broke them. The Americans are exploiting the breakthrough as we speak. We'll be in Falaise within the week. The entire German position in Normandy is collapsing. You were right about everything." Simonds nodded but said nothing. He looked exhausted, decades older than his 31 years. Montgomery continued. "But the cost, Simonds? The friendly fire casualties. The French civilians. The Air Force is already complaining that we turned their strategic bombers into terror weapons. There are going to be questions. From the press. From Parliament. From our own senior commanders who think we crossed a line. Did we cross a line?" Simonds asked quietly. It was Montgomery's turn to be silent. That was the question, wasn't it? They had won a great victory. They had saved thousands of Allied lives by ending the stalemate quickly. But they had also done something that felt fundamentally wrong. They had used overwhelming force against an enemy who had no chance to defend themselves. They had accepted civilian casualties as a calculated necessity. They had killed their own men through predictable friendly fire. Where was the line between military necessity and moral bankruptcy? And had they crossed it? Montgomery never answered the question directly. Instead he said, "History will judge us, Simonds. Maybe they'll call us visionaries who revolutionized warfare. Maybe they'll call us war criminals who used terror tactics. I suspect the truth will be somewhere in between, as it usually is." Simonds finally looked at his commander. "You said I threatened to destroy your reputation. Did I?" Montgomery considered this carefully. "You saved my reputation militarily. The breakthrough at Caen will be remembered as one of the key moments of the Normandy campaign. But morally? I think we both destroyed parts of ourselves with this operation. We did what we calculated was necessary, but necessity doesn't always align with what's right." The two men stood in silence as darkness fell over Normandy. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled as the advance continued. The war went on, indifferent to their moral qualms. In the months that followed, Operation Atlantic became one of the most studied and controversial operations of World War II. Military academies taught it as an example of innovative combined arms warfare. Ethicists taught it as an example of the moral hazards of modern warfare. Nobody could quite agree on what it represented. Guy Simonds went on to command the 1st Canadian Army, fought all the way to Germany, and ended the war as one of the most respected commanders in the Allied forces. But he never spoke publicly about Operation Atlantic. When asked about it in interviews after the war, he would deflect, change the subject, or simply refuse to comment. Those who knew him best said that the operation haunted him for the rest of his life. That he had nightmares about the French civilians he'd killed. That he could never quite reconcile the mathematics that said the operation was justified with the moral intuition that said something terrible had been done. Fritz Bayerlein survived the war and wrote extensively about the Normandy campaign. When asked about Operation Atlantic, he said simply, "I had survived Stalingrad, survived Africa, survived Sicily. But I had never experienced anything like what the Canadians did to us that day. It wasn't combat. It was obliteration. They had found a way to remove the human element from warfare, to turn battle into a mechanical process of destruction. I hope to God that what they did that day never becomes the norm, because if it does, war will become something unrecognizable." The technique that Simonds pioneered, using strategic bombers as tactical weapons in direct support of ground operations, was never used again in quite the same way during World War II. The friendly fire casualties and moral objections were too high. But the principle lived on. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, air power would be used in increasingly precise and devastating ways to support ground operations. The line from Operation Atlantic to modern precision bombing is direct and clear. So what do we make of Guy Simonds and his promise to either destroy or save Montgomery's reputation? He did both in a sense. He proved that modern warfare had changed, that technology and mathematics could be combined to produce devastating effects, that the old rules no longer applied. But he also demonstrated that there are costs to such calculations, costs that can't be measured in casualty ratios or territorial gains. The confrontation between Simonds and Montgomery, the promise to "watch me destroy your reputation," was really about a fundamental question that still haunts military commanders today. How much are we willing to sacrifice for victory? Where is the line between acceptable losses and unacceptable methods? And who gets to decide? Simonds decided that 450 French civilians and 378 friendly fire casualties were acceptable prices to pay for breaking the stalemate. He was probably right from a purely mathematical standpoint. The alternatives would have resulted in far more deaths. But mathematics doesn't capture everything. It doesn't capture the weight of command, the burden of knowing that your calculations resulted in specific people dying in specific ways. In the end, Operation Atlantic succeeded brilliantly as a military operation and failed completely as a template for future warfare. It was too blunt, too destructive, too indiscriminate. Modern precision weapons have tried to solve the problems that Simonds encountered, to find ways to destroy military targets without accepting civilian casualties and friendly fire as inevitable. But the fundamental dilemma remains. War requires making calculations about human lives. It requires accepting that some people will die so that others might live. It requires drawing lines that can never be perfectly drawn. Guy Simonds understood this better than most commanders, and it broke something inside him. When Simonds told Montgomery, "Watch me destroy your reputation," he was really saying, "Watch me take full responsibility for the terrible calculations that war requires." He was saying, "I will bear this burden so that you don't have to." He was saying, "I will do the math that leads to people dying, and I will live with the consequences." And he did live with the consequences for the rest of his life. The man who had been called cold and calculating by his peers spent his later years supporting veterans' causes and advocating for more restrictive rules of engagement in modern warfare. The man who had mathematically calculated acceptable civilian casualties became one of the strongest voices arguing that such calculations should never be made lightly. The story of Operation Atlantic and the confrontation between Simonds and Montgomery is ultimately a story about the price of command in modern warfare. It's a story about the burden of making decisions that will result in deaths, about the gap between military necessity and moral clarity, about the calculations we make when there are no good choices. Did Simonds destroy Montgomery's reputation? Did he save it? The answer is both and neither. He forced both of them to confront the reality of modern warfare, that technology had given commanders the power to destroy enemy formations completely, but that such power came with moral costs that couldn't be calculated away. In the final analysis, what happened between these two men on that summer day in 1944 matters because it represents a turning point in military history. Before Operation Atlantic, wars were fought primarily by men against men, with all the moral ambiguity and human element that entailed. After Operation Atlantic, wars could be fought by systems against systems, with mathematics and technology mediating the human element. We're still living with the consequences of that transformation. Every drone strike, every precision bombing campaign, every calculation of collateral damage versus military advantage, they all trace their lineage back to that day when Guy Simonds looked at a map, did the math, and decided that sometimes the most humane option is the one that looks most terrible. The question that haunted Simonds for the rest of his life is the same question that should haunt anyone who studies military history or thinks about modern warfare. Just because we can calculate the most efficient way to destroy our enemies, does that mean we should? And if we make those calculations, what does it cost us as human beings to live with the results? There are no easy answers. There weren't in 1944 and there aren't now. But the story of Operation Atlantic and the promise that preceded it, "Watch me destroy your reputation," stands as a stark reminder that military genius and moral clarity are not the same thing, and that sometimes the price of victory is measured not just in lives lost but in something far more difficult to quantify: the piece of our humanity that dies when we reduce human beings to acceptable losses in a mathematical equation. Guy Simonds proved he could break Panzer Lehr. He proved he could do the calculations and make them work. But he could never quite prove, to himself or to history, that being able to do something terrible means it was right to do it. And that uncertainty, that moral ambiguity, is perhaps the most honest legacy any military commander can leave behind.